Welcome to MAN 3025, Introduction to Management Organizational Behavior. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 9, Managerial Decision Making. So decision making is a pretty straightforward process. Basically what you're doing is you're choosing from two or more alternatives. Unfortunately, the devil, as usual, is in the details. First, we'll talk about some decisions that are programmed versus non-programmed. These are decisions that we look at from the point of view of, do we make them every month, every week? In other words, are they consistent? Versus the non-programmed decisions that happen and we really haven't seen them before, or they happen very rarely. A programmed decision might include things like paying your bills. You're pretty certain that when you pay your bill, it's going to go through so long as you have money in your account. Of course, there are a lot of assumptions related to that, but your certainty is extremely high. For example, you might assume that the bank is actually going to send the money. Sometimes that just doesn't occur. And then you realize it when you get a late fee and then you call the bank and the bank says, yes, that was our fault. They pay the late fee, they send the money, all is forgiven. But there are assumptions associated with that, but the risks are extremely low that those will occur. So programmed decisions are things you make make consistently, might be every year, might be every month, might be every week, might be every day. And you know the rules in which they operate, and you have high levels of certainty that when you make your choice, it's going to be a positive one. Non-programmed decisions include things like unique situations or poorly defined situations, unstructured situations, and where there are very high levels of consequences involved with the decision. So, for example, choosing which college to go to is a pretty important decision. Choosing which house to purchase, very important decision. The high level of consequences if you choose incorrectly. Choosing how much to pay for certain things can have a high level of consequence or a low level of consequence depending on your monetary situation. Now I mentioned the concept of certainty when decision making. Really, decision making is about risk taking. And your decisions fall on a kind of a level of a continuum of risk. On the one hand, you have this idea of certainty where you're very nearly 100% sure that not only do you know what the alternatives are, but you know what the chances of you choosing a successful alternative is and what the outcome is going to be. You have very little doubt about those things. And then you can run all the way over through several different layers up to uncertainty, where you really don't know necessarily whether or not the alternatives are any good, whether or not you have all the information you need, whether or not the information is any good, and if you make a choice, whether or not you're actually going to get what you choose. In other words, the probability is difficult to assume or difficult to calculate. And this kind of looks like this. Program decisions fall on the low risk section of possibility of failure and a high level of certainty. And as you move across from left to right, you'll see that you go into risk, uncertainty, and finally into ambiguity, where you really don't know what's going to happen, but you need to make a decision. With risk and uncertainty, various things change. As I mentioned before, you might change whether or not you believe you have all the information. It might change whether or not you can say for certain what's going to happen after you make a choice versus being able to predict from a probability point of view what should happen, what's the likelihood of things happening. And that decreases, in other words, your ability to predict decreases as you move towards ambiguity. So ambiguity creates decisions in difficult situations. Now, this is where your goals might be unclear, what you want might be unclear, the information you have may or may not be complete or something that you can rely upon. And the worst kind of ambiguous decision-making situation is called a wicked decision. A wicked decision is this whole thing where whatever you choose, you're going to come up with negative consequences. And you're just looking to mitigate those negative consequences. You choose this, things are bad. You choose other alternatives, also very bad. But at least with those choices, you're hoping that you can reduce how bad things get. So here are some wicked problems, some features of wicked problems that occur. Now, wicked problems inside of organizations are pretty rare. They do occur, but they're fairly rare. They usually are related to downturns in economies and things like that. However, wicked problems in society are pretty common. For example, there is a wicked problem of poverty. So poverty is a wicked problem. It doesn't go away by throwing money at it. You have to actually teach people how to live life. And that costs a lot of money. After teaching people how to live life, they still might slip back into poverty if, for example, they simply can't obtain the skills they need to work in jobs that are available in the area. So there's all kinds of issues around wicked problems. Every problem is unique. There's no clear definition of what poverty means. There are multi-causal and multi-scalar and interconnected, these problems are. There are lots of stakeholders involved. A lot of people are not happy about the idea of giving their tax dollars to somebody who isn't working for a period of time. And on and on and on it goes. So these kinds of wicked problems are more society-based, but they can occur within organizations as well. Now, with every decision-making process that you go through, there are essentially 6 steps. What's interesting about these steps is that they do not necessarily occur in order. They usually occur concurrently. So the first issue is that you recognize that a decision needs to be made. That's not always the case. That's where a big trip-up occurs. Oftentimes people don't see a problem, or they don't realize that they should be making any kind of a decision. Go back to the example of Atari, with their decision back in 1984 not to release the Atari 7800. I don't believe it was called the Super System. I think it was called the Pro System. They had this technology that was a jump up from their previous technology. However, the video game crash of 1983 had soured Warner Communications on their division of Atari, and they decided to just simply get rid of it instead of trying to revive it. And as a result, the machine wasn't released for 2 years. Well, 2 years later, or within that 2-year window, the Nintendo Entertainment System was released. And Nintendo was really smart. They came in from Japan and locked up all the game publishers and said to them, look, if you want to, we're the only game in town. Every other game console is either old or gone out of business. So if you want to be a part of, you want to stay afloat, if you want to publish games, because this is what you do, you've got to be on our console. In order to do that, you have to sign an agreement that says you will not port this game that you put on our console to any other console for 2 years. So they locked out everybody else. As a result, there was not a domestic game console manufacturer until the Xbox arrived in 2000. So we had nearly 20 years of no domestic production of a game console in an industry that is now valued at roughly $45 billion a year. So this is kind of these situations that occur when you make drastic decisions. So first you have to recognize that there's a problem, which is what this example was about, that Atari not recognizing that there was a problem. Second, you diagnose and analyze the causes of the problem, and usually at the same time you come up with criterion. In other words, what's important to you. Let's talk about buying a car. You realize you need to buy a car. Recognize the problem, recognize the decision needs to be made. Then you decide, well, what's important to me? Do I need 4-door, 2-door? Do I need a minivan? Do I need a truck? Do I need an SUV? What am I going to use this thing for? Is gas mileage important? Is price no object? Those kinds of things. Next, ideally, you would then go and find alternatives, things that you could possibly purchase as far as the car is concerned or a vehicle is concerned. Then you compare all of these alternatives based on the criterion that's important to you. Now, you've usually rank ordered the criterion. So this price might be most important, comfort second most important, third most important might be having 4 doors, fourth most important has to be an SUV, whatever it might be. So you taking these criterion, you then look at each of these alternatives and rank order each of the alternatives. Oh, I want a RAV4, that's my number 1 choice. My number 2 choice might be a Ford Escape. My number 3 choice might be a Kia Sorento, and you go down, from there. Next thing you do is you implement your choice, make your choice, purchase the vehicle, and then evaluate whether or not it was a good idea. Unfortunately, this is not usually how we tend to go through these steps. We do go through these steps, but usually they happen all at once. We're looking for a new vehicle and at the same time figuring out what's important to us. We recognize that there's an issue, and maybe we recognize there might be an issue, so we start looking for a vehicle earlier than the issue actually needs to be addressed. And so all this kind of happens all at once. We find alternatives, we make a choice about them, then we change our mind because we found a different alternative. So we don't really go through this process as far as the steps are concerned, but we do go through each of these pieces, even if they happen concurrently, meaning at the same time. All right, so ideally, we would go through these steps one at a time, and we'd follow some rules around going through these steps. You would try to, for example, use these steps to reach some kind of a goal. And you'd be most interested in getting the best value out of your decision. In other words, the decision should be effective. And the decision process should probably be efficient as well. Some other things about this as well, as far as the rational decision-making model is concerned. When you come up with your criteria, things that are important to you, you take a long time to figure out what those are, and then you rank order them. When you come up with your alternatives, you try to find 100% chance of every possible alternative that's out there. In other words, you try to find all of the choices that are available to you. And then you compare those choices to each other using the criteria that you came up with in step 2, what's important to you. And you look at every single one of them before making a choice. Now, we call this a normative model because it's how people ought to act. It's very rational, it's very effective and efficient. Unfortunately, it's not how we actually act. And for that, we have a different model, a different way of thinking. So how do we actually act? We actually use something called an administrative model. This is also known as bounded rationality. When we make decisions, the rational decision-making model has a lot of assumptions involved with it. First of all, that you're going to make a decision that makes sense. In other words, that maximizes your outcome. That's not always the case. We're emotional beings. We make decisions because something pleases us, or we make decisions because it annoys somebody else. So if we're doing those kinds of things, it's not really maximizing the outcome. It's just maximizing our satisfaction. That's a very different way of looking at a decision. In addition to that, we tend to stick to what we know, and this is where bounded rationality comes into play. We tend to only look at the alternatives that are immediately available to us. Now, there is a practicality to this as well. The rational decision-making model assumes that you have unlimited time and unlimited resources to figure out what alternatives are out there to choose from. The bounded rationality model says, hey, you know what? I don't have unlimited time. I don't have unlimited resources. I better choose what's immediately available to me. Lastly, we tend to make decisions based upon when we come across something that works for us. So if I go with what I immediately know as far as alternatives are concerned, I might also go with what I immediately know as far as what's important to me is concerned. I might say, I want a cool-looking vehicle. I want one that gets 50 miles to the gallon, but that's not really as important as looking cool. You get this vehicle and then you realize, wait a minute, I can't fit anything in here. It's just me and one other person, but I'm a social person. I like lots of people to go out with, and now I'm stuck with meeting them at places instead of really interacting with them. I think I should have gotten a larger vehicle that I can pack my friends into. But you didn't realize that because that wasn't what was foremost in your head. So again, rational decision-making model assumes that you'll figure out what's important to you and go from there. Bounded rationality says you'll just go with what immediately is available in your head. What you can think of is what you think you should be relating to, what is important to you, and then go and make a decision. Most importantly is we take these criteria and these alternatives, in other words, what we can choose from, these alternatives to choose from, and we immediately make a decision, yes, no. What that means is that, let's say I have a list of vehicles, like I mentioned before, the Kia Sorento, I've got the Ford Escape, maybe I've got a RAV4 on the line here that I'm looking at. If I come across something I like, I stop evaluating the alternatives. This is a big deal. This is something that engineers call satisficing, because the decision satisfies me, makes me happy, and it suffices. It meets my basic criteria. It gets the job done. So let's say I go look at a RAV4 and I say, I love it, I'm going to take it, I'm done. Poof, it's mine. But I never looked at the Ford Escape, and I never looked at the Kia Sorento, and I never looked at maybe an offering from Nissan, maybe a Nissan Frontier. And as a result, I might have missed out on a better vehicle because I never looked because I was happy with that choice. FYI, this is how many students who study very well and know the material very well end up doing poorly on exams. Because you come across the first choice in, let's say, a multiple choice exam, and you say, oh, that's the answer, and you don't read the rest of them because you figure that's the answer. That might be an answer, but a better answer might be further down the line, one that actually fits the question perfectly versus more generally. So, bounded rationality results in us using what's available to us and results in us using something called satisficing. Talk more in part 2.